For the next unit, what we want to look at are economic indicators. What information do they give us? What information is left out? What are they good for? And what essentially is the point? One of the biggest numbers, one of the most important numbers that economists look at, you hear about this periodically in the news, is GDP. There are two different ways to calculate GDP. The one that we're going to focus on is using the expenditures approach, or looking at different groups, different players in the economy who spend money. Our basic GDP equation, if we're looking at it in terms of expenditures, is C plus, I'll get to what the G means in a minute, C plus I plus G plus X sub N. And there are different ways to write a couple of these, but what we're looking at is consumption, gross investment, government spending, and net exports. Now, you don't want to monkey with the order in which you have these variables because they are in descending order. That means the biggest component is consumption or consumer spending. The smallest component is net exports because it's pretty much going to be negative in the United States. We have a negative trade balance. We import more than we export. That's what that means. Anytime you see the term net as opposed to gross, it's net because you are subtracting something out of it. So for net exports, you might see this written as exports minus imports, maybe X minus M. If the M is bigger, then it's a negative number, so we're actually subtracting that off the end. So, net means you're subtracting something out. Gross, as in gross investment, that's a G, is not net investment. Gross investment means that you are including depreciation. And we'll get to what depreciation means later. But if you're looking at the difference between gross investment and net investment, net means you subtract the depreciation out. Gross means you leave it in. That's the difference between net and gross, and you may see some of those terms. All right, so these are your components. They're in descending order. What's nice about this formula, first of all, is that it's pretty easy math. You just have to know which aspects of spending you're putting in here. How might you see this as a question? You might see a whole bunch of different categories of numbers, and you have to know which ones to ignore, which ones to add in, which ones to subtract out. Okay, so this guy, not a big problem. Now, the other thing that I want to do with this is take these components and build what's called the aggregate expenditures model. This is not something that most econ books will do at the same time, but I think it'll make more sense if we build it in pieces. And we're going to start with consumption because it is the biggest one. So, how do you graph consumption? Just like when we looked at demand and supply, and we went from the schedule to the graph, you can do the same thing with consumption. What we're looking at is at different levels of income, how much money are people spending? So, how do we graph that? We want to know at different levels of income, what are you spending? It's pretty basic. You just have to remember what goes on which axis. Now, to start us off, we want a 45-degree reference line. A 45-degree line is special in that the slope is 1. That means for each dollar of income earned, you are spending that dollar. So essentially, every point along your 45-degree reference line is a break-even point, potentially. But that's not how people actually behave in the real world. It's not a reasonable assumption, and it's not how life actually works. So, what you're going to have instead of, just your little reference line and everybody spends everything they make and they never go into debt and they never have anything left over, is something more like this. Now, this also mirrors a typical consumer life cycle. Because what happens when people are young, or younger, is that they tend to make less money, so they're on this end of the income scale. At that point, you're spending more than dollar per dollar what you make. So this whole area right here, where your consumption line is above your reference line, you can call it two different things. You can call it debt, or you can pull one of those lovely econ terms that you never see anywhere else on the planet and call it dis savings. That's actually the word, sort of. Dis savings, or the opposite of savings, which means debt. It's the same thing, it's just a different way to put that. Now, you're young, you're at lower income levels, you're going into debt. As your income potential increases, eventually you get to the point where your consumption line and your reference line cross. That is your break-even point. At your break-even point, you are spending exactly what you make. You are not going into debt, but you are also not having any money left over. As income continues to increase, which hopefully happens over the lives of many earners as they kind of move along in their careers, your reference line is above your consumption function, or above line C here. That says that we're actually spending less than we could be. This is where you are saving money. So we go from a situation of being in debt to breaking even to being in a position to save. Now what this tells us is that people at lower income levels are more likely to have debt. What this also shows us, if we look at our intercept right here, where the consumption function crosses our axis, even if income is at 0, you still have to spend money to live. You still have to buy food, clothing, and shelter. So there is a base level of spending that accompanies being alive, even if you're not making any money. And that's this distance right here. So if somebody suddenly loses their job and they have no income, does that mean that life is free? No, it doesn't. It means that you still have that it's not quite a sunk cost, but you still have that baseline where you're going to have to spend money no matter what.